Well, hi, everybody. It's Bob Ost. You know what that means. It's Friday. It's August 18th. And this is the TRU Community Gathering, something that we started doing in 2020 as a response to, as a very reluctant response to COVID and shutdown. People didn't know what to do with themselves. I didn't know how to run my company. I didn't know what I was going to do with programming that had always been done live. And we also had been very New York centric and very live and New York centric. And then COVID said, do it a different way. And I learned about Zoom, and we opened up the Zoom room so that people could come and be together, be a community while we were all in isolation. It was surprising. It was surprising how important that turned out to be. I was just doing it because I didn't know what else to do. So here we are, this week 169. There have been 169 consecutive weeks of TRU Community Gatherings since 2020, April 17th. Conversations have evolved. Obviously, at the beginning, we talked about what the hell has happened to us? Why are we in quarantine? What is quarantine? How can I be an artist and be in quarantine at the same time? How can I be a theater artist, which is a performance art? How can I be in a performance art where there are no performances? So we started learning about Zoom. We started learning about virtual. We started learning about other ways of telling stories. We started focusing on things like radio theater, radio drama, podcasts, other kinds of ways of telling stories because we didn't have access to live theater. Well, that's changed. You know, we've come back to live theater. Live theater hasn't necessarily come back, but we've tried to come back to live theater, and we have struggles that we're still going through with getting audiences in. But COVID is no longer having us in quarantine and having us masked and all that. So, and in spite of that, I've managed to get it 4 times, as recently as 4 weeks ago. So COVID's still here, but it's not as much of a dire threat. I do always advise people to be aware of the fact that it is still here and that there are people who might be more vulnerable, and be considerate of them, be thoughtful, be conscious. So here we are 169 weeks later, and I've been having conversations every week with different people who are involved in different aspects of theater making. And we've talked about audio drama, we've talked about podcasts, we've talked about the use of sound. But I think this is one of the people that, my guest today is one of the people who I think is best equipped to talk about text-based theater and soundscapes and other ways of telling stories that don't necessarily require us to be in a live room. Although, if I'm not mistaken, I think Radiotheater does have live performances when it's up and running at full pace. So let's bring in Dan. I want you to meet Dan Bianchi. Hi, Dan. How are you?
How you doing? Okay. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. Welcome to TRU. Actually, you're not new to TRU. I've known you for a good 20 years, or maybe longer than that. Maybe even almost since the beginning of TRU. We've been around for 30 years.
Yep. Yeah, I've been here 50. I'm getting old, but the radio theater portion of it began 21 years ago.
Okay.
So my past theater was another lifetime.
Well, you know what? Tell us about that lifetime. I think it's interesting to know about your roots, because one of the things I actually really want to know is how you found your way to such a specific niche that you're in. The radio drama. Radio drama is so specific, especially these days. I mean, there was a time when radio drama was the norm because we didn't have television. But you found your way there. How?
Well, the short version is I started in theater in 1970 or so, 71, went to Europe and so forth, got into Brechtian theater, big giant shows with 30 people on the stage, 3-story sets, live bands on stage, whatever. So did that, came into New York just when I thought New York was thriving with theater back then, Joe Papp. And I mean, we had magazines that were just dedicated to New York theater, mostly downtown theater. So I kind of grew up in all of that stuff as well, and made my rounds with all of the classic theater companies in New York. But to do the Brechtian theater was a particular type of theater also. And I was able to get by doing those big shows like that. And I won Best Director off Broadway 3 times doing all of that. Then I got itchy for Hollywood. And went out
Did
there.
you indeed?
Yeah. Well, I love the movies I grew up with, really. But I went out there because, you know, again, if you win some awards here, people take you out there right away. That's the old story. And made my rounds there and did a few things, but I got known as, I won the award for Best Screenplay of the Year. And
So let's pull some of these threads apart. So you started off as a director, or did you do any acting? And now you're
No.
implying that you also did some writing.
The writing began everything as well. And again, I had some plays that got very controversial, and it just, things blended to another. By the time the 1980s came and Reaganomics and cutting all the theaters I was growing up through, the 70s and so forth, started disappearing because the rents went from 300 to 3,000 overnight. And all of a sudden the plays no longer, you could afford that many people on stage.
Do you mind naming some of the theaters just for historical reasons? Like,
Circle Rep Company on 7th Avenue and Circle in the Square on Bleecker Street.
Yeah,
not the Broadway Center, were 2 of them. Even the Public Shakespeare started cutting back a lot. It was so thriving back in the 70s. And of course, it had Chorus Line to finance it.
Yeah,
you know,
that was
as
a
it got
big bolster for it.
Yeah. So they were able to do a lot of experimentation that these days, no, it would cost almost like a Broadway play. So that's where I found myself. I had a cinematic mentality, multi-scenes and so forth and all of that, which I was able to do in that kind of theater. But once you got it cut back to, we can only afford 2 actors on stage and one or both of them have to be known people. And I said, to me, that's just listening to 2 people on stage for 2 hours. I don't see much of things happening. And growing up as a visual artist, because I'm a fine artist too in museums and so forth. So, you know, to me, it was like, how do I get around this and afford it at the same time? So I always like to do something different, not just on the subject matter, but in the technical side of things. And I looked around town, New York, and there were audio was always one of my favorite things as well. But in all of our life, I always looked around, and people, even with their cell phones, are so particular what the audio is, or in your car, or at home, the home stereo systems, etc. and so on. But when I always looked at theater, it was, oh, sound, that's on the bottom of the budget. You know, you're able to ring the doorbell 3 times and whatever else. And I said, that's not what I'm talking about. And I don't mean sound like, you know, Phantom of the Opera. That's a different kind of sound design. I'm talking about fashioning a script around, that's our technical, that's our premier technical end of things, sound, audio. So I looked around town. I didn't see anyone doing that, big shows and small shows.
So this is interesting to me. So you weren't inspired by somebody else to do this. This was your own idea. You just said, I think sound is a great element of theater and it should be used more.
Well, yes, because like I said, in the other media, um, uh, again, whether it's anything, TV, radio, and whatever you have at home, cars, even your headphones, people have started paying exorbitant amounts of money to get the right sound, to get the right, music particularly, of course. And that's what I thought, well, then how come we're not doing that in theater as much, or especially at the low budget side of theater? And then people said, wow, we have an old speaker over here. You want to use that? And it's like, no, it's okay. So I had to start from the ground up, even building technically our furniture, let's say, which is speakers and microphones and all of that sort of thing. But I was always a live theater artist. It didn't interest me to go back to the radio side of things. Now, at that time, about 20 years ago and maybe 10 years after, if I go on the internet and you look around the nation and you see anyone else doing this kind of stuff, well, yes, a lot of big cities, Washington, D.C. and so forth, and out to the West Coast and so forth, a lot of them had their resident radio theater companies, which most of them, again, I could see them on the internet now, how they performed it.
Let me ask you this. So resident radio theater companies, but they were not doing, were they doing live performances or were they doing strictly
Well, they
live?
would, yes, they were doing the live performances,
Okay.
but it was by, let me say, enthusiasts, who love the old time radio shows, but not necessarily actors. Yeah, and so I would look at these things and I'd go, there's no lighting, there's no nothing, there's just people standing on a stage in maybe a local high school, and they'd get the audience because people are, especially the older crowd who remembered radio theater. I'm not from, radio shows. I'm not from that era, but I am from early television. And so I knew people who grew up with radio as their basic. Yes, they had motion pictures, but that was an outside event. You went there, it was a special happening. Let's all go to the movies. But here was the first time these stories and entertainment and comedies and whatever, adventures and so forth, were coming into your living room. And you could sit around in your underwear and drink beer, close your eyes, but you're on the planet Neptune with, Flash Gordon or whoever it is, or the Lone Ranger or the this or that. And that interested me because that was so I started to, investigate, do my research, find out, who were these people, these actors in New York mostly, and the directors and so forth. And they were the gods of, entertainment at that time. Yes, Broadway was much bigger than it is now in importance to the people going to see it. Everyone knew whom everyone was. There were household names playing in this show and that show. And so, of course, it didn't cost $250 a seat to go. So many people went, 50 times a year.
My first Broadway show cost, I think, $10.
Yes, I remember those things. And so, but that's the economic side of things. Like I said, that comes later on. But earlier on, I investigated and I liked what I was hearing. So I got into, I must own about 1,000, radio programs, the old, cuttings from those shows and so forth. And I got to know all about the insides and all of that stuff. Orson Welles was always a big influence on me, of course, both in film and obviously he's the poster boy for old time radio shows.
War of the Worlds.
Of course, one of the most famous broadcasts ever. Probably the most famous. And so that all interested me. And again, I'd go around to my theater folk and they'd go, well, I think I remember seeing one in high school. Oh, my father used to play, so it was all that kind of feedback, but never anyone who was really into it, except, as I said, back about 20 years ago in New York theater, there were several radio groups around that were lasting maybe a year or 2 years or whatever. But again, they weren't theater groups, I might say. Once again, it might be enthusiasts who love that stuff and want to be in it and not take the time to learn a play, by heart and all of that sort of thing.
I want
So
to I
that
want to ask
was
you this. I want to ask you a
what.
question. From the time when you first had the idea to do this, and when you first started doing your performances to today, have your ideas about the form changed, or have you learned things about the form as you've been doing it, or did you sort of start off with an idea of what it could be, and you were fulfilling that vision from the start?
Well, I had started my life in the arts, in the serious arts, let's say.
Correct is
You know,
serious.
well, yes. And I did teach it in colleges and got to be known to be the Brechtian actor. So I always loved the breaking of the fourth wall. I always loved that people on stage are talking to me. You're talking to me in front row, second row, whatever. So I loved that. Was entertainment. I mean, that's what a comedian does. That's, that kind of show that does. And so I love that kind of theater. And again, most of the theater offered to me at the time, I was not really a journeyman director. I was someone who, I do my own stuff. And so I couldn't fit that into a lot of what was happening, in theater. Anyway, I said, I got to come up with something totally different, something, like I said, affordable, not just to me, but to my audiences. And I don't particularly need superstars to be in it, because we're not selling the face. In what I learned, you asking what I learned mostly is that what they used to call radio shows in the old days, I mean, it only had a short period of time, the late 30s through the 40s. By 1950, television was the thing, and radio shows pretty much died off. The BBC was the one group that keeps it going to this day. And sure, they can attract superstars in their league, but that's a different ball game. At that time back then, the local groups around here, they weren't performing in legit theaters, the radio shows. They were in churches, in halls, those kinds of places, because you didn't need to have a legit theater to do this kind of stuff, which was a plus. Again, I didn't have to go back to theater owners and start negotiating and playing around with that game again, which I always hated, but that's part of it when you want to be a producer as well, obviously. And so I started molding my theater, my ideas, to this idea of making a low budget, adventuresome show. I grew up, let's say, with monster movies and horror movies of the 50s and so forth, and all those things, comic books, etc. And but I wasn't able to do anything like that in the theater world. Now I've directed King Kong, Frankenstein, Dracula, the world, the Invisible Man, on and on and on, because I focused on the one genre that makes money no matter how bad it is or no matter what it is, and that's the horror genre and science fiction.
But let it be said that you say is no matter how bad it is, but you've won awards for what you do. So you've been acclaimed for your work.
Well, obviously, when I went to some of the bigger Broadway producers, I mean, I had the Nederlanders and so forth behind me, and we were walking around gigantic theaters going, "Would you like this, Dan?" That sort of thing, back before 42nd Street was renovated. So I was walking around some theaters that you couldn't even breathe in those theaters, which are now palaces. But yeah, so everyone was intrigued with the idea because they grew up with it also, or their parents, or so forth. And whenever I talk to known actors or hear them in interviews and the subject would come up about old time radios, "Oh, I would love to do that in my life." That sort of response. And I go, well, okay. Now I noticed out on the West Coast, they were getting people like from Star Trek, Leonard Nimoy, and people like this who were forming their own radio theater groups. And of course, they could get those kind of actors in there on, snap their fingers and, "Oh, sure, I only live 20 minutes away, and, La Brea or whatever, whatever it is, and they, pop in and what do I read? This over here? Okay, ready? And that's what I liked with the New York, or I should say it was across the nation, Chicago, the big cities, and Los Angeles. But the actors that came in the 40s were in shows that you didn't rehearse for 6 weeks every day. You come in at 3 in the afternoon. You're playing the nurse. He's playing the doctor. This is the victim. And let's rehearse it a little bit. And we go on live at 7. Boom. And they did it every day, different topics, different. Oh, I got to run across town to NBC. I'm in a cowboy show. And then, and Orson Welles, of course, the famous story is he hired a ambulance to wait outside for him in CBS so that he could pop into that after his 7 o'clock show, get over to the NBC studios at 8 o'clock, do another entire show, and so forth. Like I said, that kind of livelihood, those actors, it all went away when television was invented and or took over the home, I should say. And
yeah, it had been invented for a while. But
yeah, I mean, it took a while, but even if you get to watch, especially if you can on YouTube and all those things nowadays, where they have some of those old antique shows that were recorded live and saved, and black and white, of course. But it was like watching a bad off-Broadway play sometimes, where the set is rattling and,
well,
things are falling down.
Let's move into the how-to of it. I mean, what do your productions consist of? How do they, what are the budget items? I mean, we're a producers organization. What are the budgetary items? Clearly, you saw Radiotheater as being an affordable way of doing things on at least a perceived larger scale than you could do live. And it also happened to have been a very good form for the kinds of work you like. You said you were attracted to horror and science fiction and dark topics, dark things. So, which I think is what you're known for. I think a lot of people find that to be a lot of fun as well. Yeah. But what was your first show? What was the first time you actually took the step and said, I've been thinking about doing this. I like the idea of radio theater. I like the idea of being able to use sound effects and soundscapes and tell my stories through text. What finally got you started?
Well, I put together a show at that time I called it Shock Theater, which again is based on, I don't know if anyone remembers, they had live hosts back in the day in the various cities, Philadelphia, New York, and so forth, had the horror shows, and they would introduce the movies and all of that. And one was a famous one called Shock Theater. So that was my thing. And I got some big Broadway producers. I mounted a reading down at Westbeth Theater, which was a big experimental theater place. Now it's owned by the New School. But they were giant audio rooms, black rooms that Edison, Bell Telephone, Bell Sound, invented back in the turn of the last century or the 1910s, 20s, and they were sound studios when sound was invented. And that's where the New York business of filmmaking, before it moved to LA, was being made. Then Bell moved out to Jersey, and those big studios were left there. And my friend, his father was a big real estate magnate in New York, kind of took over the whole place just for his son, who had just graduated college and didn't know much about anything. But I did. So I went in and said, I have this new idea, blah, blah, blah. And I put together my, backers audition, we'll call it. And again, being, a jack of all trades, I build, I design, I paint, I do this, whatever's necessary. Plus I compose, make the music, write the scripts, and direct it. I don't act. So I said, I need.
Well, that shows great restraint, the fact that you don't act.
Yeah, well.
You do everything else.
But believe me, I mean, this is why it's been hard to pass it off to someone else as I get older, because I just mentioned like 10 people who would be on the budget and forget about it. Then you wouldn't be able to afford this thing.
Oh, can
To
I
do it,
just interrupt for one second? Have you worked with union or non-union talent over the years, or both?
well, I always worked union, but in the beginning, with all my other shows in the past. But then I'll never forget, maybe my second or third show into the Radiotheater. By the way, you asked where did I do it? I started out down at the Crane Theater on
The Crane,
4th Street.
East
Crane,
4th, yeah, East 4th.
East 4th. And, it's a 99-seat regular theater with a stage and so forth. And I said, let me, experiment, see if I even got something before I tell anybody. So we did that. And about my third show in, we were union. A newbie on equity actor, young girl, went back and told the union that, what he records us in the first reading. And I would have one of those little pocket recorders because I have to make the music that will fit, the length of time someone's speaking or so forth. It's not live music, but that's another story here about getting into that. But that's what sets us apart from any other group, big or small, is the music. And I've been nominated Drama Desk Awards, all that stuff, because of the sound of music, and won awards as well. But in any case, then I got a call from Equity saying, how dare you do all of this, blah, 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 screaming, mad, etc. We're pulling all the actors out of the show. So I had one non-union actor left, and I had a ton of non-union actors who wanted to do it. I said, okay. We sold out every single night. And the actors who got taken off the show kept coming back to me, Dan, can I be in the next one? Whatever they wanted. But I said, not my union, that's yours. So since then, I said, that's the way to go. That's exactly. I treat everybody fantastic. I pay them 5 times more than what they get in a union show that size. And so, nobody's ever complained on that side of things. And I've kept people for 20 years. So that's the other side that, as you began talking before about COVID, kind of put the kibosh on everything for me.
Well, I know you told me that you lost your actors not because of COVID so much as because they couldn't afford to live in New York, and they had to move out of New York.
Exactly. The younger ones, and I'm speaking like 35 years old, 40, whatever, people who had gotten into their lifestyle of being able to afford living here, but also doing what they love to do. And I didn't require, as I said, full-time rehearsal that a traditional play does or musical. So once we got our pattern down, I always had it in my head, and I would tell them this too, I'm not just making this stuff up, but the actors back in the 40s who came from Broadway, and Broadway, there were a lot more shows. There might have been 45 plays in 1942, just straight plays that were on Broadway that year. When they didn't have a job on Broadway, they hopped over to the radio station across the street and acted in those things. And those were the people that were taken into New York live television shows early on as well. And you had the young guys, James Dean and all those people too, who were brought along with them and quickly went out to Hollywood. Anyway, the COVID, hit my company pretty bad in that regard, that everyone was going home to mom and pop, and we'll be back again, Dan, once this is over. But I knew that when I saw the clouds starting to clear and theater was getting back, and all of a sudden, whatever rents they were paying were twice as much when they left town. So then they're coming back. And I see them now online. Yeah, they went off to make families and do whatever normal people do. But in any case, I said, so now what? I had my one guy, my big actor, who has the voice that everyone flocks around after every show and want autographs and everything, Frank. he's still with me, and he said, I'm good. You know, he comes in from Connecticut, and my right arm is my technical guy named Wes.
So, so
He's,
this is
that's
getting
all I need.
this
That's
is
all
getting
I
into
need.
the details that I want to get into, because
What?
like how do you do it? I mean, what are actors on script? Are they off book? Are they at mics?
Right.
How's it staged? How's it sound? How do you create effects?
Hmm.
I know a lot to do with lighting, and
Well,
give us a sense. Give us a tutorial on how to do this.
well, I also plan this to be a touring type of a group, which is also you keep the budget down. The touring theaters want you, and it's the sort of safe show that everyone across America, if we're going to do King Kong or the War of the Worlds or something like that, right? It's not going to be controversial in Oshkosh. You know, it's fine. So I knew that I had to keep it like that, and we could be opening, and we do play in giant theaters bigger than a Broadway house. You know, those big old time theaters when they used to have traveling Broadway shows to the big towns. You know, down the coast. You know, Summer Stock and all those. These are, you know, have 2 balconies, 3 balconies, gigantic theaters with monster stages. And we've played in those, but and it's lucky because then we could use the house technology rather than carry our own stuff. And we played in smaller places, in colleges and so forth, where we split half and half. Most colleges are well equipped nowadays with all that kind of audio stuff. So we don't have much to bring with us, and that's great. In the beginning, I thought, well, we got to have some kind of set. I mean, something. You know, are we just going to stand there with the microphones and
That's what I wanted to know.
yeah, well, we have. I said, you know what, this is closer to. And I always said this to my younger actors coming on new, going, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, well, look at it more like we're closer to a musical group, let's say a Beethoven quartet. Um, that people come to be entertained and live, and will pay great money to see 4 people walk out in black outfits, sit on a chair in front of their podium with the music sheets on it, pick up their instrument and play for 2 hours. I said, we're closer to that than a Tennessee Williams play on Broadway or something, or anywhere else. I said, this is what we are, closer to a musical group. And then it clicks in their head like, oh, I get right. You're not playing characters per se. And this is where the Brechtian side of things come in. You are yourself on stage. Yes, you may use different voices, etc. But I'm not one of those voices, as you can hear. But they started getting used to that. And I trained them just like the 40s actors. We got a show next week. We'll do 2 rehearsals. We're on. And boom, they got it. And people walk out amazed. How did you do that? And the real answer to most of that is I discovered a software, a music software that only Hollywood uses. And I was able to adapt that to make my shows sound like motion pictures, cued
Wow.
live by my technicians. And that's why we have to time the cueing sometimes to what the actor is speaking, or the actor has enough rehearsal that they could time their own to end exactly on that crescendo. And people go, how did you do that? Because I have a full orchestra playing like a Hollywood movie. Then you add the multitude of 150 sound effects that all have to be played live, you know, cued live. We don't have the old man in the corner with a bench and all the little click clack things on it and slamming a door. And all, to me, that was hokey, old time. I wasn't interested in creating a museum piece from, this is the way it was in the 1938. And we wear a straw hat and dress up with bow ties. No, that's not what I'm doing. I'm doing experimental theater that no one is doing now in the 21st century. In the 20th century, we start and so forth. I said, and that's how I got away with it. And people would listen to me, you know, when I walked in the door, theater owners and other producers, because I had a background track record that I wasn't out of NYU last week. And I have an idea. Can you give me money? You know, which is I find there's a lot of what's going on
How
these
about
days.
lighting? How much do you use lighting?
Lighting, again, being a film freak from the old days and so forth, I go with lighting that's from that film noir period, you know, where it's coming in the window or something like that, from the side, from underneath, to underlighting the face. So think of a person, the actor standing at his black music stand with his script on it. They have to talk out to the audience at all times. I said there's no reading of scripts here. Just like someone has their Mozart sheet music on the stage at Lincoln Center, I said, do you think that person doesn't know what that piece of music is by heart? They've been playing it since they're 13, yeah, that sort of thing. But it's there to refer to while the other person's talking across the stage. You might glance down and know what's coming up next, so you're boom, right on it. And that's why we don't need, 30 rehearsals to do this. We could do it in 2-3 hour rehearsals or 4 hour, whatever, sometimes. Lighting is right on the music stand itself is the basic lighting. We have 2 lamps that one shines on the script pointing down and one up under light on the face. Gives a little spooky undertone, of course, that you're not used to seeing in traditional theater. We don't use overhead lights at all. We use side lights, all different colors. I go back to the Italian cinema of the 60s and so forth, that they were known for that sort of thing. All of a sudden, there'd be a blood red wall and a green wall over here and blue outfit that someone's wearing. You go, where's all this coming from? It's not coming from the window.
So it sounds like you have a visual aesthetic as well. I mean, it's maybe an audio piece, but there sounds like you have something visual in mind. You want it to
Well,
look
like I
like
said,
something.
I'm an artist. I've been a painter since I was 17. So, and as I said, big time. So I have the visual sense as well. And I could tell right away if something's not going to work. But I'm pretty good at assemblage mentality that, hey, give me that stool over there and hand me that old chair there. And why don't we put this, or sit in this and sit, and I'm able to put it together that people literally come up to the front of our stage, and we have a line of them down the center aisle taking photos of our little $50 set.
So I gather from what you've said that the norm is for people to come in dressed in black. But do you ever use costumes? Have there ever been exceptions where you've used costumes?
Not. We once did. We did go off the rails a little doing a 1940 shtick radio show. And I went out and I bought the costumes. This was way back, maybe 18 years ago or something. And it was big tables and chairs and candles and all the rest of that kind of stuff was going into it. I bought gowns for our singers. I had, a piano player, all the rest of it that went along with it.
You had what they call a budget.
Yeah, but the budget is always mine. Oh. That's one thing I stuck with since the beginning.
You mean out of pocket?
Yes. Okay. I said, if we can't afford what we're doing, then we shouldn't be doing it. And I stuck to that because I already had done the other theater. In the days of Carter, President Carter, money was free. and in the arts, it was like, what do you need? Here's a check. I got like 250 grand from Carter administration when I ran the theater, which is now the Soho Theater. It was down on Van Dam Street.
Soho Playhouse, yes.
Soho Playhouse.
Yeah, Darren Cole.
And I was paying Broadway construction people, all the rest of that kind of stuff, full money, and everyone was getting paid well. And that was equity as well, of course. But there was no law about, because that was near, I don't know, 180, 185 seats or something like that. I think it still is.
Yes.
But we could do off-Broadway. There was no 99 seat, oh my God, you're going to have to do something and blah, blah, blah. You can't do that. If you wanted an off-Broadway ticket price, which was, God, I remember $3.50 sometimes back then. But if you wanted to call yourself off-Broadway, there was no big stipulation that, well, now you're going to need like $50,000 more. You just, upcharge the ticket.
Well, it is very different today.
Yes. So it's hard to say, well, how do you get started? Because if someone else wanted to get started today doing that kind of stuff, right, you really have to know the technical end of things, but at the same time, I'm a producer as well. So I go around and I make my deals wherever I can. And as I said, I kept cutting back on whatever we needed on stage, and yet still made it look like something that people would want to take a picture of. And yet we would have big audiences pre-COVID, and rely on that 3 times a year. We would do, month-long shows, 5 days a week, whatever it was. And everyone was having a ball, and we have a big following. Then COVID hit, and we, like everyone else, said, what do we do now? Well, some of the big ticket brokers got in touch with me because their business went down the hole with no live shows to sell. Dan, do you have anything? I put together albums. I call them albums, but it's all online, of our live recordings. And since we focus on live recording, they sound great, a lot of our shows. And as like you are there. So with all the music and sound and everything else. So they went off the charts, selling them across the world during COVID.
So you were very well positioned for a shutdown.
Well, there you go. But
Yeah.
I don't know if you recall, but with all the articles and so forth being written from the theater world, interviews with producers and so forth, the downside looked like, well, this might be it for the rest of eternity, for all we know, and there was an offshoot company, Star, no, what was the name of it? That started to just handle video shows. And these were from the big off-Broadway companies that were financed. And of course, the government was giving them even more financing to stay alive. And I would go see some of these shows that were doing, not shows, but they were making videos of a closed theater location. And they had movie paraphernalia, tracks that were doing tracking shots and crane shots and everything. I'm going, oh my God, the theaters are turning into movie theaters. Yeah, not theaters, studios. And I'm saying, is it really turning into that? Oh my goodness. So we were in a big church. So we have a gigantic, area with movable seating. So we push our pews to the side, and voila, with my movie background, I said, that's what we're going to do. I bought a big camera and so forth. I said, but I didn't have my actors. And I had my one big actor. Okay, well, with Radiotheater, we could get away with that, but I can also record piecemeal some other actors who can't really be here to do it as a regular show. And so we made our little movies and put them in festivals and so forth.
And then you got into something called editing at that point.
Oh yeah, well, here's another thing. I began as a 35mm film editor as well in the film field.
So okay, so that wasn't a challenge for you.
No, I mean
okay.
what was the technical side, because I left that field way back when people were still editing 35mm film like they did in Charlie Chaplin days. Then all of a sudden it became, what is this thing? Computers, and you had to know every, 40 billion other ways. So I got my technical person to do as I tell them to do. And we made these little movies and so forth, thinking this is going to be the future. This is just the beginning. We'll finesse it and things will get, more and more. Lo and behold, COVID is over. The theaters are going to open up again. And I said, what? What is this? And I didn't have my whole cast, as I said. My crew is basically me and my right-hand guy who does everything on computer. All those cues, almost 200 sound cues live, almost another 150 music cues live. But I make all of them at home. Then we go into the rehearsal, we meet the two of us and piece it through the script and say, this goes here, this goes there, and Then we call in the actors. Hopefully they've been through this procedure already.
Wait,
So
suddenly there's a we. I thought it was always you. What is the we? Who else
we is
besides you?
my technical, I call
Oh,
him
your
my
technical
technical
guy.
guy.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah,
That's
Wes.
it. Okay.
And he is, fantastic. He can do anything, the lighting, everything. Young fellow I picked up when
So,
he was like not even a senior. I don't know what he was, a freshman in NYU. And now he's
to
in
go
his
back
30s.
to go back to one of the key things you said earlier is one of the things that's made your company helped it to survive and made it viable all these years is the fact that you take on so many roles.
Yeah.
So for anybody who's thinking about doing what you do, they just need to be aware that it's going to cost them a lot more because they're going to have people doing things. Did you write almost all your scripts or all of your scripts, or have you taken scripts from other places?
No. Again, I said, all right, I want to brand this group, Radiotheater. No one else had that name. And at NYC, I put at the end of it. Okay, so everyone knows this. If you're coming to see Radiotheater, you're coming to see Radiotheater. It's not called a Brilliant Day Theater Group or something or other. It's like, what the hell do you do? Here this is what we do and only do. So I've had millions of scripts, mailed to me and so forth. People think they're doing radio shows and radio scripts, but I don't know if I left out, but I worked in Paramount Pictures and so forth. I was the highest paid script doctor in Hollywood at one time.
You were a script doctor, okay.
Yeah. So they would call me, like a doctor, Dan, get in here. We have no third act, in a movie, that kind of stuff. And so I would go, all right, but it wasn't my stuff. I didn't like working on other people's stuff that I didn't particularly care for, but I could do it. So when I came back to New York and said, I'm doing my live theater again, but I'm not going to do theater. I'm going to do something different. And this is what I came up with. And so I said, now scripts. I like all those horror movies and so forth, many of which were the first things to be recorded live on radios and all those kinds of things. Frankenstein, I mean, Orson Welles and his group did Frankenstein and Dracula and all those things too that I grew up with and he grew up with in the old movie world. And so I said, that audience is always out there. The theater audience is about an inch wide. The horror audience is 4 miles. And I said, that's who I want to clue into.
Couple basic questions I want to come back to. Rights issues. You talked about doing King Kong. You talked about doing War of the Worlds and some of the Poe. Poe probably isn't. It doesn't have any rights issues around it. But how about other pieces that you've adapted? Would you say you've written the scripts? In many cases, you've adapted existing stories to your
stories. Yes, yes. Well, that was my brand. I said we're bringing classic horror fiction, not that someone made up last night where blood and guts are gushing all over the, something that they saw in a movie last week. Now, these are classic works of literature. They're all public domain.
Okay, so everything that you
yeah.
do is public domain. That was, I guess, the question I should have asked.
Yes, yeah, and right, I'll get people sending me, I wrote a script. It's about me and my girlfriend sitting on a bench in the park, and it runs about an hour long. Is that okay? No. Look at my website.
Right. I mean, we tell writers all the time that just do the research, do your homework.
Do the research. I just got another one yesterday. Sent me one. Oh, he does a great, Edgar Allan Poe live show and so forth. And he sent me a video, and I feel like I'd feel bad sending him my video because.
Well, let's talk about the Poe Festival. Let's move to the Poe Festival for a second, because you've got something called the Poe Festival. Isn't that the thing that you're going to actually
the what?
Do?
Oh,
Poe Festival. Yeah.
Well, we've been doing that for what we do. We just did 14th annual.
And what is it?
And it's usually 4 weeks of about sometimes 12 different short plays, or what do you call it? We can sometimes go up to 15. And we split them up during those weeks. And so I made it so it's a festival, so that every night is a different format of listing of shows. So if you see 4 tonight, whatever the main ones are, the Telltale Heart and so forth, those things. I'm coming back next Thursday because I want to see that. And I had, I don't only have an audience that comes once, but with our festival format, they come in numerous times to see everything because now the Poe, phenomenon, I call it, was always our big moneymaker. People from around the world come, and when they're in, I schedule it at tourist time, May, June, and I get foreigners from all over because everyone knows Poe, everyone loves Poe, and to this day, even Netflix just made a movie about Poe last year. They're making another one about Poe himself this year.
Well, the one they made last year was kind of
yeah,
wasn't it a murder mystery that
murder mystery.
Yeah,
Yep.
I saw it. It was okay.
Yeah. When he was a youth at the army, what do you call it, upstate.
Yeah.
But I've seen plays about Poe, and of course, there's tons of one-man shows who get famous doing their one-man show as Poe, just like they did, any other poet and so forth.
I'm going to bring in some questions from the room because
okay. Is it getting late?
It's not too late, but it's little. I want to because some things have been brought up as we're talking that I would love to actually address. And Owen, I'm going to be starting late on questions in terms of what's on the in the chat. Find ones that are earlier if I've missed them, and we'll bring them in. But RK Green asked while we were talking about this, is there a crossover into audiobooks? And that's not exactly the question for you, because I know that the question is, what is the difference between what you do and audiobooks? And you actually have written that to me and told me what that difference is.
Well, of course, people assume that right away. They either assume that, oh, you're a play reading group. No, not at all. And I said, you don't get nominated for John Modesto Awards against big, Broadway shows because we read plays. I said, no. And, oh, well, like Audible, I read books, I have a lot of actors or the voice actors, of course. I said, we don't just stand there and read short stories written by Poe or whomever, verbatim from, the short story. I have to adapt them to perfectly fit with an audio format. So you have to go back and listen to what the old time audio writers were about, the radio writers, and it was called the theater of imagination. Well, yeah, because you had the vocals, you had poor music, obviously, maybe an organ player, just something like that to play highlights when it got spooky. But you had the voices of the actors, and that's what I tell my actors. We don't have instruments per se on stage with our podium and dressed in black. Your instruments are your voices. And so I cast, you wouldn't cast a musical group and say it's a quartet. If you had 4 violins, you need, a viola or a cello, whatever, and so forth, all have a different sound, and blending them together, or just like a rock band. You don't want 4 lead guitarists as my group. You have to have the bass player and all the rest of the guys, the drummer and so forth. So that's the way I went about casting as well, that, I got a voice that's at a different level here, and they got the deeper voice and so forth, so that they can get a wide variety of characters they get to play, staying with me over the years, the villains, the beggar, whatever it is, femme fatales and so forth, and get to play, screaming and all those things they wouldn't ordinarily get to play on a theatrical stage.
Arcade, does that clear up the difference between audiobooks and what he does, what Dan does? Or did you want to know more?
Well, I was just interested to see if there was an opportunity to leverage, the radio activity, and that was those performances for audiobooks, and whether that's a new, opportunity for source material.
Well, like I said, I have about, 12 to 13 albums of all of our live shows, and it goes way beyond what I was mentioning here, the titles and so forth. I don't know if you guys know H.P. Lovecraft, but wide
Thanks to
following.
Netflix, we know H.P. Lovecraft very well now.
Okay, well, wide
several-
following around the world. In Hollywood, it's hot as anything. The poor guy died penniless, but we're known for the only one in the States of doing the consistent live annual Lovecraft Festival. And I do it in the same way as Poe. Pick out 10 different stories. I adapt them to fit my actors I know I have. Oh, he would be good for this. Oh, you know what?
And,
She
and
would-
those are public domain?
Yes.
Oh my
They
goodness.
just- Yeah, they got into public domain, I don't know, 5 years ago, maybe something
Oh,
like that.
okay.
But I've been doing it anyway because no one pays attention. If you want to call the copyright police now, I mean, I don't care. But in any case, we were always invited up to Providence, his hometown, Rhode Island, where they treat him as a god there and had giant Lovecraft festivals. And boy, we always, people from all over the states and the world, it wasn't a New York group, seeing what we did, they, you couldn't walk around the town after that because there's the guys from doing Lovecraft. And so my actors get a boost out of all of that. Besides, I love it. So they put you up in great hotels and all of that stuff. Besides, again, hit by COVID, wipe them out. After so many years, I think they're just stumbling back now using seminars with scholars and so forth, but not the entertainment side of things.
Well,
So I, as you were saying, okay, about the leverage there. So if you listen to any of our live recordings, an evening of either a one title play like a King Kong, which would play for the 4 weeks because it's a full length play. I call them plays, if that's what they are, but or scripts, and or the festivals of the short stories, which we have a lot of. And as I said, we put evenings together. And I also found that an evening of 1 hour and 15 to 20 minutes is just fine. Audiences of today with short attention spans, they don't want to know that. What do you mean? We got to come back for another hour and a half? There's an intermission. No, they love it, leaving with smiles on their faces that this was fantastic. We're coming again. And that's what I like. And I like keeping, because I'm the one on the money side of things. But I make the deals with the venues that no one makes deals like I say, because that's the first thing every producer asks me, how did you do that? And I go, because a lot of people want to have shows that are drawing people into their house, even a church that has almost no congregation on a Sunday. Yet,
well, I think RK has an interesting idea, which would be there might be some form of partnership between you and Audible, which would make your life easier, actually, and probably give them material that they can use that they need. They need things to
they're
do.
predominantly dealing with publishers, literary publishers, and of course, is it SAG actors? I guess.
SAG, yeah.
And so forth. They have their own theater now on
Minetta Lane Theater. They've had it for a while, yeah.
And every play they do, I was ready to see, like you say, some kind of changeover there. Was just plays, just 2 or 3 people on stage or something. And like I said, well, where's the Audible come in? They just want to be theater producers, and had some material.
I'm going to get somebody from Audible on the show probably in October. So
okay,
we'll have that conversation.
But I did contact them early on because we were here before them, and I said, "What is this thing?" And I said, I did introduce that. This is what we do, and if you want to listen to it, boom, I sent stuff. But to see us, yes, it's not something that. Like I said, I've dealt with Broadway producers and so forth and bigger shows and so on. But I look at it like we're not here to really, when big producers coming tonight, can we go to Broadway next week type of thing? Because what do you do with it?
Right.
You
You
could
have your
put,
you have your audience, you have your niche, you know your
right,
market. You have your
yeah.
market.
It's alternative theater, which is what I came from all the years ago. We call it off Broadway, whatever. I don't remember calling it that back then. It was just, experimental theater or something somewhere along the line. Equity give it categories so they can make a buck as well. But
Well, the categories equity gives are based on the house size.
yeah,
Basically,
well,
that's where the language. That's what the language is how
yeah.
big is the house.
Well,
Candy Carl has,
oh,
has an interesting question. I don't know
okay.
how to ask this. She says, what about the encroachment of AI? I guess the question I would ask would be,
To pay
do you
who?
see AI as being a plus or a minus for for what
I've
you
been,
do?
again, as a visual artist myself, I've been, let me see, what is this all about? Blah, blah, blah. I don't want to be an old timer and be cut out of what everyone's talking about. I've explored it wholeheartedly. I can't be bothered with it. At this point, I don't know if it'll turn into anything
Well,
else.
a lot of us don't want to be bothered with it. The problem is we think it's going to be bothering with us. It's going to be it's
well,
going to be
that's
affecting our lives.
yeah, that's the science fiction, story that we've seen a billion times since the 1950s about, I am really a robot you're speaking to. But other than that, as I said,
I think the issue is AI has developed to the point where it's actually able to replace jobs and things that other people do. I mean, the whole SAG-AFTRA thing right now is about the
yep,
strike is about the fact that actors are going to be paid a single time for using their image, and they can computer generate and use their image and manipulate their image in perpetuity. In perpetuity? Are they kidding?
yes.
But yes, I mean, so there are ways that AI is going to be impacting us. We can't really avoid it.
Yeah, as I get older, I don't know how much longer I will be in it. Maybe someday I will see that, but I don't think I'll be a part of that because I think it'd have to be much younger myself. I mean, even in the painting world, in the art world, of course, that's taken over as well. But it's all looks like commercial art for, selling goods or whatever, but not something personal from the heart type of stuff. And yes, it's very innovative and ingenious, but just like NFTs were for the past couple of years, and everyone said, you're not an artist if you're not making NFTs, because people are making $20 million out of little images and so forth. Well, that's all a bust 2 years later, and nobody's making them. And
Yeah,
the people who bought
non-fungible tokens. We actually had somebody talk about them last year. Yeah, I guess. Well, okay. We can move on though.
Yep.
Susan Crawford wants to know if you were influenced in any way by Garrison Keillor, and I guess the question is, what do you think of Garrison Keillor as a storyteller?
Well, again, he was someone who made, well, his whole shtick was that we're just a hometown bunch of people putting together, stories here. And he'd have the live sound guys over here and the live little bass player and the combo playing behind the music, and his group of actors that would come in and say, "Good morning, Clem. Good morning. How are you doing?" Not my bag, you know what I'm saying? So to me, he never resonated with me at all, his stories, etc. Because, as I said, I came from the horror film world and science fiction. I own thousands of films. People call me up from around the world going, Dan, who played so-and-so in 1937, so forth. But as I said, those movies made their fortune on sound.
What do you think of Val Lewton?
Val Lewton, of course. Well, sure, he was somebody that made it big back then. But
is that your wheelhouse? Is that your aesthetic?
I love his stuff as well because he stayed on the periphery of the real big commercial filmmaking. He's one of those that I'll make movies my way, but you're going to have to make them with a star here. Okay. The star happened to be maybe Boris Karloff, but that's fine with me. So that's the other side of things, that so many actors, and not the old timers, like I said, the younger ones too, that clued into it maybe from the radio show you just mentioned, so forth, that they even made the big film of it, right? With Meryl Streep was in it, and all of that, with the radio guy you just mentioned from the hometown.
Gareth Keeler, yeah.
Garrison Keeler, right? Wasn't it a big? It was a big movie made with 1 million different actors in it, because they all wanted to get their foot wet, toes wet in, if just that movie alone, radio shows that they once read about, heard about, see it somewhere, their parents and so forth. And so he was able to rope in all of these big names, even if they're in it for 10 minutes or something, and based around putting on the live radio show. Well, that was the live radio shtick, I call it, that most of all those radio shows across America, and it's a stigma, especially when you're starting out. Like when I start out, they'd look at me like, oh, radio show, oh, yeah, we did that at our church, back in Ohio, whatever it was, or in high school or something. And they all had it preconceived notion, that's what you do? I say, you got to come see us, and you'll find out nobody does what we do.
I think one of the things that you've said to me, but you haven't said today, that I think is important, is that one of the key elements of what you do is imagination. The reason why you think that one of the reasons I think you think you're successful, based on what you said to me, is that you have created a form in which the audience engages their imagination, and therefore it stays with them. They remember it and they want to come back to it again. They fill in all the blanks. They fill in the world. You suggest the world, they fill it in with their imagination.
That's why the scripts have to be written a certain way to allow that to happen. And basically, it's something that if the script says, you can listen to the old radio shows, maybe a detective show, and the dame walked in the door and she was beautiful from head to toe, sparkling in diamonds. I never saw anyone so beautiful. And on to the story. Well, if you're sitting in an audience of a few hundred people, you're going to have a few hundred conceptions visually of what that beautiful girl looked like. I didn't give you descriptions of, she was 6'1" and she was a blonde and red high heels.
One green eye and one blue eye.
Right. And this is what television, this is what theater, and this is what motion pictures do that we don't do. They give you what the director thinks is a beautiful woman, what the director thinks is a monster, and so forth. And 400 people sit in the audience going, oh, okay. It's not what I would have thought, but okay, whatever you want. And that's what whole generations have grown up with, from Lord of the Rings and everything else. There's no more magic in the mind, the imaginative mind.
We always talk about in theater, one of the things that distinguishes the live theater from all the other filmed forms is that live theater, the audience is one of the characters. And I think in your work with Radiotheater, you have given the audience an even bigger role than they normally would have. They have to create the show in their head. And you suggest it, and you prompt them in ways that lead them, that guide them along the path that you would like them to take. So there is some sense in which you are molding the experience for them, but they're filling it all in.
Well, the visuals, yes.
Yeah, the visuals. Yeah. So I want to ask Owen, did I miss any questions from earlier? And are there any questions that we want to catch up on before we call it an evening?
Sure. Here's another question it's a three-parter from Candy. Dan, in your collection of audio programs, is it scripts or recordings? And do you listen to radio classics on Sirius XM radio? And if so, which show is your favorite?
No, I don't really listen to, when I was starting out with all this, I'd seek out whatever was around that I could find, from here to California and back, mostly the BBC though, the old time radio shows. As I said, the modern ones, I could never find something along the lines I was looking to make. So, my experience with that only went so far and said, okay, but I'm not doing that. I'm doing something else. and I had to go out and make it because I couldn't go to bigger producers and say, well, you know, that group across town, you know what they do. That's what we're going to do. Oh, I get it. Oh, okay. I saw them once, you know, and there was none of that. I
Well,
had
now
to.
now people are saying, do you know what Radiotheater does? Let's do something like that. You're now the example for people because you've
Well,
created something unique.
what my goal was, though, from the beginning, was because I came from theater, was to bring this wonderful software into traditional theater. And I would go to big time directors and so forth too, and go, you know, that play you're doing, then it could be anything, Shakespeare, I don't care what it is, O'Neill, anything, modern play, and I'll score it like it's a movie. And all you need to do is put the little clips mics that now every actor uses, whether it's a play or a musical. I said, you don't have to stand there with microphones in your hand.
I will have
And-
to I will have to confess that I never expected that the initial inspiration for what you do would be an app, a music app. But it's interesting to know that what it's evolved into with your other areas of expertise, your directing background and your interest in horror and science fiction. You've created an aesthetic, and I know you have a following, and it should be just acknowledged that you've created quite a phenomenon for 20 years, you said? I think you said.
yeah, 21st year. And through COVID, they went by so fast that it's almost like, wow, 2 years is cut out of that.
Yeah, we all feel a loss of life from COVID. Owen, are there any other questions?
I believe that's it.
Then I'm going to
Actually, there's one that just popped in.
Oh, okay.
Dan, when and how did you discover Lovecraft? From Janet Common.
Lovecraft. Ooh, geez, like I said, I was always interested in horror and so forth. He became, I wouldn't say fashionable, but, you know, all of a sudden he was popping up in a lot of things. And I kept reading that Lovecraftian and an influence by H.P. Lovecraft in this movie or something or other. And I go, okay, so what's that? Can't do Poe forever. But
Right.
It turns out Poe was his favorite. He kind of bridges the gap in the horror literature world. After Poe comes Lovecraft. So early on, though, I read everything, talked with everyone around the world. Japan is even bigger influence, and with Poe as well, they're more influenced, and with King Kong. Yeah, and you know, it just grew that I found out that, wow, there's a large following underneath that. It's not as big as Poe, but we started doing the Lovecraft, and we would have the young college crowd coming in, and they all knew Cthulhu and all these different references and so forth that they learned from playing games, video games. They didn't even know he was an author. They didn't even, that died in 1930s. They didn't even know, you know, where all of that came from. They just knew all of that mysterious background, the stories, the creatures, whatever it is that he fashioned in his short stories that were barely published at all in his lifetime. And yet a whole group of writers kept his name alive up until there was a guy in Queens, New York, who owned the rights to it, had it, you know, first copies and everything in his basement, and he wouldn't allow anyone to touch them. Well, he died, and then the rest is history. So now you can do what you want. And so that's what I get. I get people from all over wanting to do their Lovecraft stuff now, but I already do it. So.
Well, I think we're going to call it a night. We're probably going to have people stay who want to ask you more questions if you can stay. But I'm going to say a few parting words to YouTube and to my podcast viewers. So again, thank you, Dan Bianchi of Radiotheater New York, NYC, for being with us today and giving us another aspect of theater that we don't always think about, and giving us some insights into what you do and then the success that you've had with it too. I think the success is an important thing to really underscore, because you have done this very successfully for 20 years. To those of you out there in podcast and YouTube land who have stumbled upon us or have actually looked for us and found us and want to know more about us, I just want you to know that Theater Resources Unlimited is an arts service organization. We're not for profit, and we basically help people understand and navigate and become successful, hopefully, in different aspects of the performing arts, focusing mostly on theater, but we have other things, especially since COVID has introduced us to the Zoom world and the virtual world, and now we're getting involved in other things. If you want to be part of the room and you want to ask questions, I can arrange that. You can just email me at trunltd@aol.com. That's trunltd@aol.com. Just ask to be put on the Zoom list and we'll invite you every week and you can be part of the conversation. We've been doing this as a public service since COVID started. We are serving the community by offering this. We are offering it as pay what you can. Pay what you can does, in many cases, mean free. It means pay nothing. But if you can pay something, now that we're going back into live performance, we're going to have venue expenses and all sorts of expenses. And we need to have some source of income. So if you can give us a donation, we'd appreciate it. Go to trudonate.com, trudonate.com. That's trudonate.com. It'll redirect you to our donation page. We don't necessarily own that particular URL. Give us what you can. We'd appreciate it. Come back in the weeks following, next couple of weeks. Next week we have Austin Pendleton, film legend. I mean, he's just the legendary character actor from film and also TV and theater. Then he's directed, and he's an interesting guy and one of the nicest guys in the business. Come hear what he has to say about why he does what he does and why he has interests in theater and film and how that's differing, how those different art forms differ in terms of how he functions in them. And then the following week, we have an interesting conversation with the Vice President of TRU, Cheryl Davis, who's coming with her collaborator, Leah Simone Bowen, who the two of them recently did a revise of Scott Joplin's Treemonisha. We're going to talk about Treemonisha. We're going to talk about how you adapt something, how you update something, how you respect the past. The Treemonisha is very much loved by some communities. Was it okay for them to meddle with it? Did they make it better? What's it like now? I think it'll be an interesting conversation. And then we have things coming up all through September and October. We're going to keep doing this. And I hope that you'll be with us and continue to listen to us and continue to be a part of our room if possible. Thank you all.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Dan.